Steve with eXp Realty. Thanks for joining me here. Looks like I only have one ear in the virtual background, but I have two. Appreciate you joining me. I want to go over an offer with you on how to write an offer. Let's see here. Share my screen real quick here. So this is Instanet, it's called. So from your MLS right here, you can go to menu, you can go down to Instanet. You click on that. Instanet or transaction desk, they take you to the same place. Instanet, it has my favorites right here. If you put a star next to it, it'll show it up on this bar right here. So Instanet is going to take you over here, and you're going to go to create transaction. You're going to go to put in a name. We'll just put my name in here. There's different templates that we have set up, but if you don't have a template, you just put no template, type residential, purchase or listing, and then you're going to put import data as if it's in the MLS. So if it's in the MLS, you get the MLS number. So we'll click on this one and just show you, let's see here. MLS numbers in MLS and Flex MLS, it's going to be at the top of the listing. So we'll take this for example. Let's see here. Right here, you just copy and paste this number. Import data. Create Albuquerque Association of Realtors, create. Wait till it loads. It's going to load in the street number. It's going to load in the listing agent's information, the street name. You just hit next. You can fill out some of this information. Typically, I do it on the contract, expiration date, acceptance date, closing date. It'll populate it from here into the contract, but we'll go through it on the contract. So it brought in the seller's broker. It adds me as the buyer's broker, seller's broker. Here's where you would add your buyer. So you go to add a new transaction contact, put your buyer as a buyer here, name, number, email. That way it populates their information into the contract. So you want to add your buyer or sellers here. Go to forms, go to add. You click search up here. We put in purchase. When you scroll to purchase agreement, there's construction, seller owned lot. There's different purchase agreements here. A backup addendum purchase agreement. Purchase agreement residential resale is what you want. Click on it, hit add. You can add an addendum if you want. Say you're asking for seller to give $2,000 in closing costs or buyer to pay $2,000 to seller's closing costs, which we're seeing a lot more. You would add an addendum. So just put addend. This commercial one, it's basically the same thing. It's a general one, but we'll do just a general addendum. We'll add that. We're going to go to next. We're going to go to done. This is where you can add documents like eXp required documents or any additional documents you have on your computer. But right now we're just going to put done. And we're going to click on the purchase agreement. It created the transaction for you. It's loading here. Purchase agreement, here we go. So, sorry, I was just closing other windows here. So New Mexico Association of Realtors purchase agreement. So you want to go through the buyer. These are your broker duties: disclosure, honesty, reasonable care, compliance with any local, state, federal, fair housing laws, anti-discrimination laws, all the stuff you learned in school. You have disclosure of any potential conflict of interest. So if you friends or if your brother, sister, mom, dad is a buyer or seller, you want to disclose that. Written disclosure of any adverse material facts. If you know it has a leaky roof, you want to disclose that. Section B, in addition to the above broker duties, owes the following broker duties to the buyer and or sellers. So timely presentation of all responses and written offers. So be timely with your paperwork. Advice to consult an attorney. You want to tell your buyers and sellers you're not an attorney. If they want an attorney's advice, to consult one. We're not contractors, accountants, prompt accounting for all money. Maintenance of any confidential information in the course of prior to agency. These are the different types of agency that you want to go over. For some reason, it didn't load all the page there. So you have buyers, brokers, disclosure. So here you want to type in that you're a transaction broker with or without a written buyer broker agreement. Typically, I'm not getting buyer broker agreements, but they are good to implement when you do a buyer consultation. You can tell them, hey, I'm working for you. I'm committed to you. I appreciate if you sign this agreement. This just states that you're committed to working with me since I'm investing my time into you. Those really mostly you can only they only hold up in the court, you know. So if a buyer goes and buys with another realtor, a lot of times you have to take them to court. So I never really do that. I mean, you could argue with the other realtor, you have the agreement, but it's just a good time to tell them and show them that you're representing them. But do a buyer consultation. We'll send you one. You can create your own if you like as well. And you just answer any questions they have, go through the process, the fees, the whole breakdown, show them how you're going to represent them. You have their back. You're going to work to protect them through the transaction and help them out, keep their best interest at mind. Agent with the written buyer broker agreement with agencies. So typically we don't practice agency in New Mexico. Transaction broker without a written buyer broker agreement, but a compensation agreement. That's if it's a for sale by owner. And give me 1 second, I gotta grab this call. That's if it's a for sale by owner and it's not listed. It's not a listing agreement. It's a compensation agreement. 1 second here. Oh, they hung up. So in-house transaction. This is buyer seller consent to dual representation. This is buyer broker is licensed under the same qualifying broker as the seller's broker. So if the seller's agent's with the XP and I'm with the XP, then we put buyer's broker is licensed under the same qualifying broker. Buyer's broker is also a seller's broker for the property in this transaction. Broker has a written listing agreement. Transaction broker, that's if you have the seller and the buyer, then you're seller's broker, buyer's broker, and a transaction broker. Brokerage is representing both buyer and seller. So that's if you're same brokerage, but not the same qualifying broker. Brokerage is requesting, that's dual agency, keep that blank. So typically we're marking transaction broker without a written buyer broker agreement, leaving 2 and 3 blank. 4 is conflict of interest. So we're going to put buyer broker has transaction coordinator, Kristen Brunson, unless you're doing all your own paperwork. Then you can do your transaction coordinating, or if you have a different TC, if you have ownership interest in the property, you mark that. Conflict of interest or material interest, family, business, personal. Right here, buyer's broker knows adverse material facts of the property. So if you know it has a leaky roof or there's past issues, you want to disclose adverse material facts. There's a form, 2100 form, that if you mark any of these, you have to fill out as well to get the buyer and seller to sign. Brokerage relationship, this is a seller's broker. Usually you want to mark that they have a written listing agreement. You do want to mark that if it's in the MLS. If it's in the MLS, they have a written listing agreement. Agent with the written listing agreement with agency, leave that blank. Transaction broker, if it's like an off-market property, but they have a realtor, you could do transaction broker without a written listing agreement, but compensation agreement. Most of the time it's with the written listing agreement. Additional disclosures, if they have a transaction coordinator, or if they say, seller's their mom, you can mark that here. Buyer is a New Mexico real estate broker. You want to mark that if the buyer is, or if they're party to another buyer broker agreement. Seller is New Mexico real estate broker. If they are, you mark that. Your name. Qualifying broker's name. And their license number. eXp Realty address is a realtor. The seller's broker's info goes here. If you're directly on the team or if you're co-brokering it, like I'm on the deal with you, you can put my information down here and yours up the top. If we both need to be on the paperwork, parties, buyer's name, seller's name, date of settlement signing, typically 30, 35 days out, depending on the lender and the program and the time and date, but be careful on that. I say they're going to accept it tomorrow. I go 7, 14, 21, 28. I would go for closing on the 24th. You always want to try to close on a Thursday because it sometimes doesn't fund and record till the next day. So it would be by Friday. They get the keys for the weekend. But if you close Friday and late in the day, it might not record and fund until Monday. A lot of times sellers are not giving the keys until it funds and records. That's when it's official. So if you close Friday, they may not get keys till Monday, which a lot of people like to move over the weekend. You want to set up your buyers for that. So you want to try to close on a Thursday. Purchase price, for example, 200,000 here. If it's 3.5% FHA, that's 7,000. Just putting in some numbers here for you. You could put to be determined by lender for the amount of the loan. Just want to go over this. This is not a real contract, so just explaining it to you. Time off market. So time off market is if you're offering the seller extra money to pull the house off the market so you can get inspections. Seller keeps this whether the deal falls apart or not, unless you do an addendum saying tom fee to be refunded to buyer upon a successful closing, which you can do, or to buyer's closing costs. But be careful on that. Typically we'll see $100, $200, maybe $500 if it's multiple offers here, to give the seller extra money to show that the buyer is serious about buying the house. Seller keeps the money if the inspections are bad. If the buyer can't get the loan, they'll keep that money. So it's most of the times non-refundable. So read this here. You want to go through this contract a few times to learn the different sections, the different parts and what's involved. But this is just a quick breakdown for you. Earnest money, that's money that goes to the title company, typically 500 or 1,000 or 1%, but about 500 to 1,000. This money is money that the seller can keep if you miss on some of the dates. So be careful on that. If the inspections come back, needs a new roof, seller won't do it. They get their earnest money back. They lose the tom fee, the seller keeps it. Usually we want to do a check. We're going to do to Fidelity, National Title. Usually we like Mark Dorak. Usually within 2 days from the date of acceptance. There's some certain circumstances where you could do a tom fee and then do the earnest money after the inspections to lower the risk of having potential issues over arguing earnest money. Sometimes if the buyer can't get the loan, that's a contingency that they met, but sometimes if the seller doesn't sign the earnest money distribution form, the title company won't release it unless they have a signed earnest money distribution form. So there's some cases where that's a challenge to get both people to agree and sign off on it. So the tom fee, time off market money, was created to lower the earnest money disputes. But typically we're putting a couple hundred there just to sweeten the deal. 500 earnest money, Fidelity National Title Company, check 2 days from the date of acceptance. Gross receipts tax here, usually that's going to be in the listing. Under GRT, gross receipts tax 02-100. You can find it through the county. Typically it's site built homes. Let's see. Residential resale. I think that's the next question here. You're going to have, this is fixture. So anything fixed to the property is going to stay with the property. So you have fans, Anything attached to the property should stay with the property. You set the seller and buyer up for that. Anything attached is a fixture, it's fixed. Personal property includes anything that can be moved. So unattached outdoor lighting, hot tubs, storage sheds, dryer, washer. This is where you put in, if the buyer wants a fridge, you mark it here. Garage door remotes, if they want the washer and dryer, you mark it here. Exclusions, if anything's excluded, like you want the shed to be removed, you could put that here, or a play set. If it's a cash deal, you mark cash. Readily available. If it's available, if it's contingent upon closing of a cash out refinance, you can mark that there, or sale of another home. No later than usually put 3 days here for this buyer to give proof of funds. If it's a cash deal, it's basically a pre-qualification letter, but proof of funds is they have the cash available. Loans, if they're getting a loan, you mark loan, you mark whether it's FHA, conventional, MFA, VA. We'll go over all those different loans. Depends, but talk to the lender. You get a buyer, you get them pre-approved. You talk to the lender to see what they're pre-approved for and what program they're going to go with. Loans, usually you want to do, buyer has made pre-application for a loan. You don't want to write an offer for someone who does not have a pre-approval yet. You want to make sure they're pre-approved to buy it. Usually I show them one house at least if they're not pre-approved, and then you push them to get pre-approved so they know their budget and they have a pre-approval and application. Let's see here. Buyer shall provide seller with a pre-qualification letter from the lender. Usually I put within 1 or 2 days. You should have that when you're submitting the offer ideally, but if it's a Saturday, they're approved with Bank of America, you're not going to get a pre-approval letter till Monday or Tuesday. So try to go with our preferred lender because they'll get a pre-approval out same day in most cases when you're submitting the offer. Usually we'll put 3 days here. So what this is, excuse me, if the buyer cannot obtain the loan, you have to notify the seller within 3 days of closing or settlement signing date closing, or they can lose their earnest money. So if the buyer says the day of closing or the day before closing, I can't get the loan, seller's given them enough time and they're past 3 days, they'll lose their earnest money. But if you tell them 5 days before closing, they can't get the loan, they can get the earnest money back. Seller financing, this is if the seller is doing owner financing, you're giving money and you're avoiding the bank, it's owner financing. Buyer sale closing and funding contingency, if the buyer has a house to sell and the purchase is contingent upon them selling their house, meaning they have to sell their house in order to buy a house. This is buyer sale closing and funding contingency. You would put the address here. You would put on or before certain date, typically 30 days out, or if they're closing in 2 weeks, depending how far out from closing they are. Buyer represents that buyer's property is currently under contract for sale. That's if it's under contract, which typically if you're writing an offer, you want your buyer's house under contract. If it's not under contract, you can try that route, but sellers are going to say, you're trying to buy my house, you need to sell your house and it's not on the market yet. I'm going to try to sell it to someone that doesn't need to sell or that already has their house pending sale. So A is the best option, but you have to have the house under contract pending sale. If they're going to get it up in the next few days, you could put this here, and these forms need to go along with that. Appraisal, cash or seller financed. So if it's cash or seller financed, you mark here if the buyer does or does not require an appraisal. If it's a cash or seller finance, there's no appraisal required unless the buyer wants one. So you would mark yes or no and who's paying it. Settlement signing date, that's the closing date. Typically funding is the same day or the next day, but I usually always put the same day, 24th. So you have possession date, funding date, and funding and recording is when the deal is final. So it has to record with the county clerk in order to be final, and then the funds are dispersed to the seller. So you close, buyer closes, seller closes, you send the documents to the lender to get approved. Once they're approved, the title company records with the county, and then they send the seller the money. So typically it takes 4 to 6 hours after closing, or up to 24 hours. Possession, typically at funding date requirements are satisfied. 1031 exchange, if your buyer or seller is purchasing a property and doing a 1031 exchange, you want to mark that here. Examination of title liens, typically sellers ordering title commitment from whoever we put the earnest money to. So Fidelity, National Title, Mark, Dorak. Within, usually we want it there within 2 days, date of acceptance. This is a review period after receipt of title commitment, and all documents referred to herein. Buyer shall have usually 5 days to review, 5 days to object. Usually 5 and 7 days is what I put in here, unless it has otherwise indicated up to 14 days automatic extension. So these have automatic extensions here. Property shall be conveyed, usually general warranty deed, prorations. So typically we're seeing buyer paying appraisal, paying appraisal reinspection, credit report. Loan assumption is if you're assuming the loan from the seller, which is not really too common. Origination fees from lender. These are all loan related costs. Buy down is if you're going to buy down the rate or discount. Points, usually tax service fee and flood zone cert are going to be buyer. Other is nothing. Closing fees usually seller. Prorated data seller. Legal doc prep seller. Special assessment is normally only on land. Prior title retrieval policy seller. Cancellation policy seller. Buyer recording fee buyer. Seller recording fee seller. Document processing fee seller. Title fees are typically seller. Loan fees are buyer. Prepaids are buyer. Flood insurance is usually not required unless it's in a flood zone. It would say on the MLS under flood zone here. Flood zone. One of these options here. Oh, zoning flood zone X. So there's X and Y. So you want to see if it's by the river, it could be in a flood zone, and they can check with the insurance agent, but typically it's not required. If you put not required here and it is, then it goes to the buyer. Policy, title policy, seller policy, and owner's policy, seller. Mortgagee is a buyer, the mortgage. So buyer, not required if it's a cash deal for mortgagee policy. We're going to have foundation inspections. This is for manufactured homes. So unless it's a manufactured home, it's all not required. You have a survey, which is typically seller. Elevation certification is for when it's in a flood zone. Impact fees is land in most cases. Transfer fee, HOA, typically goes to seller. Home warranty, that's for the buyer. So you talk to your buyer if they want it, yes or no, buyer, seller. The buyer wants to ask for the seller to pay for it, you can mark it there. Appraisal for cash or seller financing, mark seller, buyer, or not required. Not required. FERPTA, that's to protect the buyer if the seller is foreign and they leave the country and they don't pay the taxes, they can go after the buyer. But the title policy makes sure that any foreign person, they do hold money for a certain amount of time. So exception normally applies. This is kind of backwards. So exception is most common. The sales price of the property, it's not more than 300. Buyer is using the property as primary residence. So as long as it's under 300 and it's primary residence, exception applies. If it's over 300 or they're buying it as an investment, it does not apply. Application, insurance contingency. Usually I'll give 8 days for them to shop for insurance, another couple of days for them to, for the deadline. So if you read this, it states basically if the house they're buying, they go get an insurance quote. If it's been broken into, for example, 5 times, the insurance is really high, they don't have to buy the house if the insurance isn't what they want, or if there's some crazy claim on the roof that was never replaced. So you want to tell your buyer to get an insurance quote right away. so they can start working on that and see what comes up when the insurance agent pulls the property. But they do have an insurance contingency. Say the house flooded a year ago, or there was a fire claim, there was a fire there, they can get out due to that. Survey is when they check the property lines. So it's mostly an improvement location report in a lot and block like regular subdivision. If you're 2, 5, 10 acres, you want to do a staked boundary survey where they put stakes out there. But improvement location report is checking for improvements on the property, like additions, sheds, a new pool. Then they would have to do a new survey, typically about $250. If you have the seller, you can ask them if they have an old survey. If you have the buyer, you can ask the listing agent if they have an old survey to review. This is inspection or the survey deadline. So typically you want to give about 15 days for a survey, because they do take a little bit longer. 15 to review, delivery, another 5 days to object, and another 5 days to resolve. Lead-based paint disclosure. So you learned this in school. Get a drink of water there, excuse me. If you learn this in school, you should have. Lead-based paint. Any property built before 1978 may potentially have lead-based paint. So you want to disclose that. You want to send them. They protect your family from lead. Pamphlet, information sheet, and the seller should have a form in the MLS saying if the seller has knowledge of lead-based paint, or if they have any reports or previous inspections. Public improvement district. This is for mostly newer areas like Volterra, the Boulders, Cabazon. It's an extra tax on the property owners that was for basically a bond. State gives the builder a bond to develop the area. Excuse me. So it's mostly for master plan communities. State gives a builder a bond to develop the area. Builder puts an extra tax on all the property owners. So you have to disclose if it's in a PID. A lot of the newer communities are in PIDs, but you want to check with the MLS. It should be on there. Homeowners Association, if it's in an HOA, you want to disclose that. Homeowners Association, get your buyer the information sheet, and we will pull homeowner association documents through title. Sometimes it takes a couple weeks to get in. Property tax disclosure, estimated property tax. So say the owner bought the house 10 years ago for 100,000, they're being taxed at 100,000, they sell it at 300,000, the new buyer is going to get a tax at 300,000. So you want to go to burnco.gov, do a current tax value and an estimated tax value, and show the buyer, okay, the taxes are 2,000 right now a year, which is less than 200 a month. They're going to go up to 3,600. They're going to go up 1,600 next year. We want to make you aware your payment's going to go up once they reassess the property. They can dispute that with the county, but there's no guarantee on that. So you want to get them the estimated property taxes to show them what the estimated property taxes are going to be once they reassess the home at the price they're buying it for. Septic tank, mark septic tank. If they have one, typically half-acre homes or bigger in the mountains have them. Some areas of the city on half acres like Rio Rancho have septic, but most homes are on a public utility. Wells, you mark well here if it's private, if it's shared, irrigation well. Tenants are occupying the property, you want to mark that. Solar panels, if there's solar. Usually we want to ask the seller for a property disclosure so they can pass on some knowledge from the past on what happened to the house, if there was any previous leaks or anything like that. Road documents are mostly for rural areas, big lots, water rights, if they have water rights. None of these typically apply permits unless you want to ask for a permit if they did an addition. HOA, you want the HOA docs usually within 14 days. They have another 7 days to review, 21, and usually about another few days to resolve. So anything that comes in, you review it. If there's an issue, you object to it. Seller has the opportunity to cure it, fix it. The inspections, you order inspections, you get the inspections, you review them. If there's an issue with the roof, you ask the seller for a roof, you object. So delivery of inspections, object to inspections. seller has time to resolve it. HOA docs, you want to mark this here as well. CCNRs, mostly every property does have CCNRs, so it's like a city HOA basically is what it is. So their codes, covenants, and restrictions. So you want to usually mark that. Depending on the buyer, sometimes they're more important to buyers than others, but depending on what they're going to do to the house and on the neighborhood, you know, if it's a bigger lot, they're talking about building walls and doing additions. Like in some neighborhoods, you can't build, most neighborhoods, you can't build like a 3-story house, you know, it has to be either 2-story or 1, but some neighborhoods have a 1-story code, covenants, and restrictions. So how close can you build a wall to the sidewalk? How tall can you go on walls? And you can't go build a 20-foot wall in your neighborhood. There's probably a restriction that says 10 or 12 feet's the highest, but you can review those through the title companies. Solar panel documents, you put that here if it has solar. Documents to be disclosed per paragraph 14, prorations, if they have any prorated things on the property. Solar panels is good, or any changes they just made to the property. If insurance just went up or anything like that, that's pretty unusual. Property specific leases, rental agreements, if there's leases or tenants in there, like on a 4-plex, you want to see the leases, see how long they've been there, the deposits, all that, you put that here. 2700 disclosure of mobile home. These are for mobile home manufactured homes. Structural engineer, you have to have a permanent foundation, FHA inspection, permanent foundation permit, deleting the title, deactivating the title. So that's for manufactured homes. A manufactured home has to have the title deactivated. It has to be on a permanent foundation so it can be assessed as real property. Then it can have a loan. It has to have never been moved. If it has been moved, then it's not considered a real property. In-person viewing, buyer has or has not viewed the property in person. If they're buying from out of state, you can put they have not. They haven't seen it in person. Buyer duties and rights. You want to go over this with your buyer. To conduct all due diligence, it's their right to have any inspection they want. Become aware of physical condition through their own investigation and observation, for them to do their research on the neighborhood, on crime, on what's going on, to assure themselves the property is exactly what buyer is intending to purchase. So the buyer has their duties and rights, their right to conduct an inspection. They can get any inspection they like. Square footage is not always guaranteed. Sometimes tax records are off, you know, it depends on an appraiser and if the house was measured on the inside or the outside. So you got to disclose that the square footage, there may be no discrepancy or it may not be exact. Buyer's entry, buyers shall provide reasonable access to buyer and buyer's inspectors. So the seller has to give access to the inspectors. So we're going to mark seller shall be responsible for paying any charges required by the utility companies. So the seller has to make sure the water's on so they can test the water, gas, electricity's on. If you show up to inspections and the electricity's off, maybe they forgot to pay it. You know, seller is responsible for turning those on, getting the inspector back out. Payment of inspection. So you can put seller to pay here, buyer's responsible. Shall pay for all inspections except for the following, which shall be paid for by the seller. So if you want the seller to pay for a home inspection, you would put that here. Inspection is paid by seller to pay that. But typically these days, all the buyers are paying their inspections. Typically, we want to give about 12 days to get inspections. Depending, if you have multiple offers, I would put 10 just to try to get them in as quickly as possible. Another 5 days to review them, to get any estimates. Say the home inspector said they want a roofer to evaluate it, and you have a few days to get a roofer out there. If they say the roof looks good, you're good. If they say it needs a new roof, you can object to that. Buyer waives of inspections. The buyer waives it. You can check mark it here. I don't ever recommend waiving an inspection. It's always good to get a second set of eyes to look at it. Let's see here. I'm checking what time it is here. Objections, resolution, termination. So if the seller won't repair buyer's objections, they can terminate, get their earnest money back. You want to review this, pertains to the survey, inspections. They are often adding and making revisions on this contract as well. Review it once a month, look at it, get familiar with it so you know how to protect your buyer and seller on the contract. Repair completion, typically we want the seller to complete the repairs requested by the buyer within 3 days from the settlement signing date. If it's not done, agreement shall terminate. And earnest money, if the parties are unable to reach resolution by the resolution deadline, and this agreement shall terminate. Earnest money, if delivered, shall be refunded to the buyer. Termination agreement, if you terminate a contract, you need a termination agreement signed by the buyer and seller. And this is a bunch of definitions here: home warranty contract, service provider recommendations. You have a home warranty plan shall be ordered by buyer or seller, to be paid for by buyer or seller, to be issued by, usually I'll put buyer's choice, not to exceed $600. Unless the buyer waives the warranty, you can click that. Right here you have possession. Maintenance, this just says the seller has to maintain the property and leave it in the original condition as the seller went to the property, and they can't take out refrigerators if they said they were going to leave it, or cut down trees, or sometimes sellers moving out of the house will scratch walls and beat up areas of the home, and they got to come back and fix that, or we'll find a solution on that one. Pre-closing walkthrough. Usually you want to walk the house for the final walkthrough within 3 days from closing, to make sure the seller's moved out, to make sure they cleaned it, to make sure the house is in good condition. It's kind of your final walk before walking the plank. Final walk before you sign your life away, I tell them. It's good to make the final walk to make sure they're happy with the house. Risk of loss here. So a lot of this is just legal things to protect your buyer. Every house is different. Every situation is different. You're going to mark the parties do consent to electronic signatures. Assignment, buyer may or may not assign. You're really only seeing contracts assigned on real estate contracts. It's very rare to assign a purchase agreement. But if you mark this, buyer doesn't qualify, they can assign this contract to their mom, and their mom can still buy the house. They'll still have the agreement with the seller because they assigned the contract to the seller, but that's very rare. Unless it's a real estate contract, you buy from the owner, you can assign that contract and sell the paper, it's called. So you can middleman the sale by assigning the contract. These are all different sorry, it's been a lot going through this. It's good to go through it. Read it often. Definitions. These are definitions. I couldn't think of the word. Definitions. What an appraisal is, what a broker is. So it's good to give your buyer a blank contract so they can read through this. They can get familiar with the definitions, the terms, the different dates. Addendum. If you were adding an addendum, you'd put addendum 1 here. Addendum in the purchase agreement, backup offer. You would want to mark escalation here. If you put an escalation clause, that's where you're in a multiple offer situation, and you'll say your buyer will pay $1,000 more than the highest offer up to a certain amount. But we can go over that more. Estimated property tax levy, escalation. Typically, we're just going to have an addendum and a property tax. Lead-based paint if it was built before 1978. Residential resale condominium, a real estate contract, occupancy agreement if the buyer is going to occupy the property before closing or the seller is going to stay after closing. Septic contingency, expiration of offer. Usually we want to give them at least 24 hours, but it really depends on the seller. Ask the agent if they can get your response maybe in 6 or 8 hours. If it's early in the morning, you could try to get it locked up before other offers come in. A lot of houses and sellers now are asking for 3 days to review offers, so they give people time to see the home. So hope you enjoyed that. Seller will either accept it here or reject it and send you a counter offer, or reject it altogether. Seller rejects this offer, and here is the index here. So this goes through everything. Get familiar with the contract so you know how to protect your buyer and your seller as well. You have a listing and a buyer comes in, and if they're being difficult, you know your dates and you know how to protect your seller and protect your buyer. So we're not attorneys, but we do have to know our purchase agreement, our listing agreement, different additional forms. Be confident you can fill one out, be familiar with it, and be able to explain it to your buyers so they know what they're signing. Appreciate you watching. Let me know if you have any questions, and get familiar with this once again so you can write a bunch, make a bunch of money. Have a good day.